here today to discuss chapters 16, 17, and 18 of A Discovery of Witches. But first, before we get to our chapter breakdown and the rest of our planned business, we wanted to talk about what looks like a startling omission in our content over the last couple weeks. Jen, would you like to talk about the thing?
The thing that happened. So as you listeners may know, our last episode was a TV discussion episode. And you may have noted that we made a startling omission in that episode, which was we did not talk about the trailer that was released by Sky One. So what happened was the TV gods did not smile on us. We recorded that episode the day before the trailer dropped. So we didn't get to talk about the trailer.
No, we didn't. We're going to do it for a couple minutes. And there was this moment of choice where it's like, do we re-record that? I don't know, right? Or we do a weird addendum thing to be like, right. Oh, wait. So anyways, we're going to talk about the trailer as though it has just happened and you guys can just enjoy looking over it again and again. I think that I've probably watched it a good 30 times at this point, maybe more.
So many times.
Okay, was there anything about the trailer that surprised you?
I wouldn't say it was surprising, but I know that we texted at the time that they're definitely leaning into the drama of the story more than perhaps the book does, and we think that's maybe for marketing reasons. You know, the trailer is it's mysterious and there's all this drama and there's dramatic music and you have the vampire thing being played heavily into, which we think is more marketing than anything else. So I wouldn't say that's surprising. It's just, a note.
For sure. And that could just be a matter of editing and what they think is going to reach the demographic they want to be excited about the series. So I imagine now we know that it's probably an August 2018 release. So that trailer seems super early, and maybe they're just using that time to build a great deal of momentum for the series. And so maybe they'll lean heavy on the drama at one point, heavy on the romance, heavy on the mystery in different trailers, because I don't imagine that that's the last one we'll see in the next 10, 11 months.
Right. And I definitely don't think that it, is a precedent for how the tone of the show is going to go. I think it's just marketing, but I enjoyed the trailer very much.
As did I. And I think it's beautifully shot. I mean, I think that first, it actually kind of gives me goosebumps, that first shot of the trailer with Diana rowing in the skull and the perspective that you get on her sort of up into her chest and the power of her arms as she's pushing, I thought was really, really cool, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how they do that. I am curious to see what they do with the vampire thing. If they lean too heavily on the creepy predatory Twilight thing, then I'm going to be disappointed, I think, but I trust them to treat it with a bit more dignity as the series actually unwinds.
Yeah, and I think so too. And I think so it looks as we discussed last time, they finished shooting blocks 1 and 2, which is basically episodes 1 and 2. So the footage in the trailer is just from those 2 episodes because that's what's available. So it looks like we're getting more Matthew earlier in the first 2 episodes than in the book. At least there's, some shots of him in what looks like his rooms at Oxford, probably. So, which we wouldn't have gotten in the book at that point in the book. So, and the other thing, there is some voiceover in the trailer. How do you feel about that?
There is some voiceover in the trailer. I feel like I'm going to reserve judgment. It is quite possible that audio is taken from a scene in which she's actually talking to someone, or it could be, I would not mind if it were the beginning, the very beginning of Outlander, if it were just a frame of voiceover when Claire does that whole people disappear all the time. I feel like just that
the
could
one Outlander voiceover that I enjoy.
Right, and I think that could be a tone setting thing, and that's kind of what it sounds like, is a marker for this is the kind of story we're telling you, and that story involves magic, and it's going to be our world plus this magical, dangerous vampire element. So I can see that being done successfully, so long as we don't... I would really hate for basically chapters 1 and 2 to be voiceover in the library. That would make me crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, and we did talk about that last time and how we hope desperately, but I really don't think they're going to. I think it is just audio from a different scene, or like you said, something from perhaps the very beginning of the first episode, and then we'll move away from it. Fingers crossed. We'll see.
Fingers crossed. And it looks like, based on the Discovery of Witches TV Instagram and Twitter accounts, it looks like they are now filming blocks 3 and 4, which I presume is episodes 3 and 4. There's been some footage of Marcus. I know that Greg McHugh, who plays Hamish, has been on the set. I know that Valerie Pettiford, I believe, is now in Wales, and she plays M, so I imagine we might be getting some like split screen or back and forth like Madison to Oxford telephone calls and things. So it looks like things are moving apace, which is magnificent, and I'll be curious to see when they actually announce the release date. Maybe early August or maybe first weekend of September. That would seem to be timely.
And we got the August that was from Deb's Twitter, yes?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, that's
correct.
Right. I thought I remembered that correctly.
It was either from Deb's Twitter or from Sky One.
Twitter. Yeah.
They didn't give a specific date and they didn't give a network, but they basically said like August 2018, kind of writ large. So they must be pretty sure about that. Anyways, the trailer is delightful. You can catch it on our website. I did actually post it with the blog post that went with our TV episode. So if you haven't seen it yet, please toddle on over there and take a look at it. Are we ready to talk about our chapters now?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so we are in chapters 16, 17, and 18. So where we left off last, Diana had that lovely thing about the chain unwinding. And basically she's unconscious. She's been given a sedative, and Matthew is in her room standing over her. Marcus shows up to help his father basically figure out what's going on or what to do next. Matthew asks for his passport and his laptop, essentially, and then when Diana wakes up, we realize that Matthew would like to take her to France. And we get a lot of the Marcus background stuff that I'm sure we'll discuss in between there, so I'm going to skim over it now. But then Matthew ends up tempting Diana to France in chapter 17, not because of her safety, but because he has an alchemical manuscript that she wants to see, and it seems to be at the recommendation of both Sarah and Em and Matthew that she decides to go. Then they fly to France in a private plane, because who wouldn't want to do that thing? And in chapter 18, we have the introduction of two of my favorite characters in the series, Isabeau and Mart. And we learn that Isabeau disapproves rather strongly of Diana being at Satur, and that they are going to have a rather touchy time in the...
Tense,
touchy, fraught time in the Auvergne. And we learned that Isabeau apparently has extraordinary taste in furniture. We get to see where Matthew has spent the better part of the last 1,500 years, and then we have a shower, and then we take a tour of Septours, and we discover that Diana and I have the same weakness, and it is four-legged and hooved. And we end the chapter with her dreaming about horses and about flying, and then we end. So, I think starting at the very beginning, we had talked about how we think that there are some really meaty parts of these chapters, and then there are other parts that are moving bits, I think, particularly of the romance plot along in a way that we were unable to do when we were focusing on the rest of the plot. The more I read this section, for me, I find it to be kind of an intermission. The thing that I have trouble with about it is that we sort of lose our plot speed and we lose sight of our goals in a really major way. Except there might be some sort of sneaky escalation going on in the background, because one of the things we haven't talked about as much is sort of Matthew's goals and Matthew's arc in the course of A Discovery of Witches. And even though that's not entirely complete by the time we end this book, I think there's some sneaky escalation with his character stuff going on here, because this is him trying to solve a problem the way that he knows how. And that is by exerting control and dominance and taking the situation, taking control of the situation in a really major way. And later on in the book, we'll discover whether that works or not. But I think that it's actually doing more than I initially thought it was, because I got so sort of distracted by the stables and the books and the furniture that we don't know what we're doing anymore.
And a lot of it, too, is just we're traveling, how much can we talk about the traveling, and how much can we really discuss the furniture in the plane, in the car, and all the things. Yeah, so it's not, some of it is not as meaty as perhaps our last couple of chapters.
Again, it sounds harsh, but it does sort of feel like an intermission. And for structural reasons, I find these 3 chapters to be so frustrating because all of a sudden when we get Peter Knox and when we get this thing with the picture, we immediately sort of tighten the frame around that central narrative conflict. And then Matthew basically intercedes. And it's not that he's an antagonist or anything blocking Diana's goals. He just decides for reasons of his own and because of his personality and because of who's threatened her, he tries to protect her from the antagonist in a way that he knows how. That is, he's trying to be decent about it sort of in 16 and 17 and not quite succeeding.
Exactly. I think we have some really lovely things between them, though, actually, between Diana and Matthew in chapter 16, like in between all of the problem solving, and we do, like you said, get a lot of Marcus's backstory and a lot of that father-son relationship, which is great. But we do get some really lovely moments for Matthew and Diana as well that kind of finish off what we started in the last chapter, I think.
We're certainly solidly in Act 2 of the romance at the point where structurally the characters are acknowledging their interest in one another and they are committing to one another more and more every time they interact, the intensifying physical and emotional relationship, which really carries us most of the way through France. I was reading ahead and we've got another 2 or 3 chapters of them getting closer and closer and closer before we reach another pinch or crisis point. And I guess I wanted to ask you, before we get into the meat of 16, what do you think Matthew's goals are? Do you think he has the same goal as Diana vis-a-vis the book, or do you think that he has different goals?
You know, that's a good question, and I think it's so hard to tell at this point. We know his history with the book, and we know about his research and the things that he's trying to discover, but it's very difficult to tell at this point in the book why specifically he wants the book or if he's planning to go get it. At this point, it feels like he's not using Diana to get to it, and we know that already, but it's kind of, yeah, his interest in it kind of disappears at this point, and you're like, I'm not really sure what you're planning to do.
And I wonder if it's significant that it feels like his goals change. His goals go from basically getting the book, finding out about the book, to the goal being sort of Diana and keeping Diana safe. And I think it's meaningful for him that that is a goal and that his normal way of trying to protect the things he cares about or take care of business is not as easy, like Diana is in many ways not as biddable, I think, as he would like her to be under these circumstances, and resistant, and he's trying to negotiate that, sometimes with good grace, sometimes not.
I think he fairly, like, kind of naturally moves away from his original intentions with the book into wanting to protect Diana, actually. And we never see the point where he makes that decision, but you kind of just like get the sense that he has decided to put his own interests away and put her first instead. So,
and I think that comes after a nice set of sort of backwards and forwards conflicting moments. You know, they have that very tense breakfast, and then they actually have the quarrel in the old lodge where she is really resistant to the idea that she's using magic, and that's of course when he leaves and goes to Scotland, etc. And after that quarrel, he seems to be resolved without really a lot of thought into how it's going to work to take care of her and be around her. And the change in I think that one of the things we're doing in chapter 16 in particular with Marcus is demonstrating how Matthew is changing, at least as he turns towards Diana. I followed up on something that we talked about very, very early on, which was about the POV and what we do when Diana is unconscious. And you're right, it's mostly when she is unconscious for one reason or another that we get Matthew's POV. But I also noticed a voice change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, do tell.
Well, like on page 197, after he has that very sweet sort of sad moment where he talks about how she's a witch, he reminded himself that she's
not for you.
Yeah, she's not for you. And the more he said it, the less it seemed to matter, which is lovely and poignant and sad and tender. And like we talked about before, the moments when Deborah Harkness leaves that light touch and then walks away from it are some of her best moments as a writer. Because I love that one. Like, I would put that in a Christmas ornament and hang it by twinkly lights, you know? But then we get such a sense of age from Matthew talking, where he talks about the bells of Oxford and how weary they are, or when he was talking about driving to Cadzow and seeing how it was a part of Scotland built for a life that nobody wanted to live anymore. We really do get sort of this accretion and weight to his voice that I thought was a really nice touch, and I hadn't caught it before.
And here it is. So then do we think, if we re-examine, my initial hypothesis was that it was all in Diana's POV, like we talked about before. Do we think now then, or it's all her voice like telling the story, do we think now then that they're both, or do you think it's still just one person?
I don't know, because the voice change to me felt more like an omniscient narrator than it felt like either Diana or Matthew. So it could just be that we have sort of like a blended voice thing going.
Sure. Or do we think it's a little authorial voice?
It could be.
On occasion, dropping in.
It could be. And it's not so much that I think it changes the perspective as the kind of language that is used in the Matthew chapters, or the tone and tenor of them is just slightly more somber. It's very bittersweet, really. So then Marcus shows up, and they have that little standoff at the door where Marcus elects not to enter until Matthew's hackles go down, for lack of a better word. And we get Marcus's backstory and Marcus's perspective on Diana. What do you think of this section?
I like it because I like Marcus, and I enjoy learning about his backstory, and he's definitely a character that I always like having when he's around, and like learning more about him. I think it is an odd choice to put his backstory here. It's not bad. I was trying to kind of like reason what made this the proper place to put his backstory, and I couldn't really come up with anything. You know?
Can you think of a place that would be better?
Either earlier when we first meet Marcus, or perhaps later on in the book, but then we would go quite some time without knowing really anything about Marcus. I'm thinking later, maybe when we actually get, to New York much later in the book, but would feel like a more natural place to have his backstory discussed, because we do get much more father-son action going in the latter part of the book.
But I sort of think that we have to do it here, because I think we have to do the introduction of Marcus and Matthew's POV, or when we are with Matthew, as opposed to being with Diana, because I don't know that Diana could tell this part of Marcus's backstory without revealing how far ahead Diana is in the terms of retelling, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Like, she would have to possess more knowledge about Marcus than is appropriate for her character for the plot at this stage, and so I think that would feel that would feel strange. Why did I say feel oddly? That's not right either. It's been a long weekend. Words are very hard, but it would feel strange, I think, and out of place to me if Diana were the one who is recounting this. And I think that this has to go in a Matthew chapter, and we have so few of them that since we've already done the Hamish in the last Matthew chapter, now we have to do the Marcus in this one.
Right, yeah. That is true. So maybe it is just like strictly functional where it is, and not thematic at all. Oh, Marcus brings Diana's test results, and then we get Marcus's backstory. And we find out that Marcus was with Matthew during the American Revolution. And that is how they met. And that is how Marcus was turned into a vampire after having caught fever of some kind.
Indeed. A relatively mundane way to become a vampire, actually. It's like, I got a little sick and now I'm a vampire. I think that this story of Marcus reveals a lot of both Marcus and Matthew, and then also ties into some larger themes about paternity and family and choice ethics. I think that it's a really interesting perspective on Matthew, and yet more background I think that we get for the conversation he had with Hamish about why he doesn't want to change Diana into a vampire, and it also gives us more perspective for why the Cecilia thing was such a disaster.
Sure. Cecilia. What?
Remember when he talks to Hamish about the 2 women that he killed? Cecilia, who he became obsessed with, turned into a vampire against her will in Paris.
That's right. I forgot her name was Cecilia.
And then she walked into a burning building.
Yeah, I was thinking Eleanor, and I was like, huh? Yes.
The great irony being, I think that the Cecilia thing happens historically after the Marcus thing. So I think that he must have been like really besotted indeed, or something else was going on, because it doesn't make sense with the sense...
Oh, after Eleanor. That, like, quite far after Eleanor, probably.
Correct. And it doesn't make sense with like the sense of ethics that he talks about with Marcus, and how important it is for a vampire to have a code, essentially.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the vampire code? Or at least it seems maybe as we go further into the book to not necessarily be so much a vampire code, but more like Matthew's code or a de Clermont code more than anything else. But we could talk about that, of course, as we evolve along in the series. But so we have this recounting of Matthew turning Marcus into a vampire in a cave with the Oneida, and they apparently already know about vampires, which is interesting. Sure, why not? And we have this recounting of Marcus's very early days as a vampire, and what that looks like for humans who are turned into vampires, and this kind of like thirst and need, and then eventually learning to control it and learning how to choose one's meals, for lack of a better word, and you know, reasoning why you would choose one person over another, etc. And, you know, skipping females at first, because that is very complicated. And
but here's another question, right? So Marcus is made during the period of the Enlightenment, right? He is made during the Revolution, and he is a different creature. You know, as much as we talk about Matthew being sort of feudal and medieval, there's a sense in which Marcus is very much an Enlightenment vampire, and he is very much a creature of his age. And so I wonder to what extent Marcus's upbringing and Matthew's selection of the teaching of ethics has to do with the period in which he was made and the kinds of ideas that were driving Matthew at the time. And I don't know that reconciles the seeming inconsistency between the Marcus thing and the Cecilia thing, but it could be a thought, right? And I think that, I don't know, I sort of stumbled over on page 201. Matthew was widely known for his finely developed sense of right and wrong. All his mistakes in judgment could be traced back to decisions made in anger. And I'm not sure that I buy that overall. I think that I buy that coming from Marcus. I think that Marcus sees it that way.
Yeah, and I do think many of his decisions that were bad were perhaps made in anger. I don't think all of them, because again, we have the Cecilia thing, and you're like, well, was he angry? I don't think so. You know, with Eleanor, sure, yeah, definitely. And, you know, we'll get some other stories of things he's done when he's angry and how he perhaps does not think so well, as many of us don't when they are angry. But yeah, I don't think it's a blanket truth for Matthew.
Right. And I wonder if maybe that comment is coming from the perspective of all of his mistakes, or perhaps his judgment vis-a-vis humans or warm bloods is so markedly different from other vampires, because one of the things that appears to set Matthew apart is actually a real love of the company of warm bloods and not just being around vampires all the time. And in fact, what seems to make him a loner vis-a-vis the other vampires is the fact that he is so often sort of away from the vampire clan and amongst humans and witches and demons. Primarily demons.
As we'll get hints in chapter 18, I think it's perhaps because he has a strong dislike for many members of his family, which could also influence his decision to perhaps spend less time with vampires and more time with people. I think he finds humans to be more valuable. in some ways.
I find it really interesting in this chapter how much Marcus is reliant on Matthew as a father figure that seems to have supplanted his human father in many ways, because we do get sort of a moment where he says that his human father was, or whomever is speaking, tells us that Marcus's human father believed that there were devils and demons that walked the earth and that perhaps he was in their grips. But we have this bit on 202 about, well, on 201 where they're talking about hunting and father and son and how it's a skill that he teaches Marcus as a way of how he must survive in his new life and basically raising him as a vampire. And then this second bit on 202 where Marcus is talking about the photo that Diana received and what it would be like to receive a photo of his own father ripped to pieces and tossed in the dirt to die. And it doesn't feel to me from that phrase that he's talking about his human father.
No, I definitely think he's talking about Matthew instead. But I think, his own father having been gone for quite some time at this point, since around the Revolution. And I think he's just had Matthew as a father for much longer than he had his human father as a father also, if that makes sense. I would also like to point out, and I'm wondering what you think about this, we have confirmation that they start new vampires, at least Matthew did, feeding on animals and not humans, which is kind of a departure from a lot of other vampire mythology, which is basically you turn, and in order to make that kind of final step into being a vampire, you have to drink a human's blood. So I thought it was interesting that Deb has chosen not to go that route and provide more options to the vampires, I guess. They don't have to drink from humans in order to become vampires, and they don't have to do it all the time. They can drink animal blood as well.
I do find it interesting, and I wonder if that bit about the process of becoming a vampire is really truly specific to vampires writ large, or whether it's just about Matthew believing that you should start with animals, and whether that's just part of his ethics, is that young vampires should not be released on warm bloods until they can be humane, essentially, until they can have a rationale. But I do agree that as a world building choice and as a species choice, that the ability to feed on more than human blood gives, and the ability, as we learn, to digest food in small quantities or in certain facets, like certain ways, is a good choice. It certainly opens a great horizon of possibilities for the de Claremonts and other All Souls vampires that we don't have in other series.
And maybe, too, he finds it to be a little bit more natural to start with animals because, if you, especially at the time, if you'd been hunting your own food and you were used to killing game already, that perhaps the transition would not be quite so stark and alarming if you found yourself to be a new vampire.
Why do you think Matthew chose Marcus?
Well, we do get a little bit about their relationship prior to Matthew turning Marcus into a vampire, and I think he just liked Marcus, as a human before Marcus became ill, and kind of wanted to sponsor him almost in a way.
What a weird way to think about it. Hello, young man. I should like to sponsor you in eternal life.
No. Before that, when he first meets him, encouraging him to stay and study medicine and etc. Kind of pushing him to be more than he might otherwise have been had Matthew not ever met him, I suppose. And recognizing his talent for healing and practicing medicine, etc.
I mean, the good news is that I like Marcus, so I think that Matthew made a fantastic choice. I wonder, to some extent, one of the things I don't think that we get a ton of in the course of the series is a discussion of how vampires choose who they will turn, who will be their family, who will be their children. And we do get a little bit about that in this chapter with Marcus's own family when he was in New Orleans and just basically making vampires willy-nilly.
Willy-nilly, as a young vampire. Perhaps Matthew, at this point in his life, was maybe a little bit lonely and he liked Marcus, and, you know, maybe he just felt the need to have somebody, you know.
That's a keen observation. I like that. I think I could see that. Loneliness, and Matthew does have a respect for capability and for competence that is a constant amongst the people and the vampires and creatures that he chooses. There's this one bit from Marcus, I think, or, you know, whomever is speaking for Marcus here, that I find to be a little bit cruel. And it's the bit where he says that Marcus still didn't understand why Matthew had let Eleanor die if he'd loved her so much. It feels a bit cruel to me.
Well, and I think the word let, like, feels it feels like placing blame quite a lot, as though almost in kind of like a doctor-patient sort of way, you know, like Matthew could have saved her as a doctor would save a patient, but he let her die. And that's how that reads. And I think it's really, like, quite unfair, actually.
I think it's unfair, and it seems to me that is a marker for us that Marcus doesn't know everything about Eleanor or about his father and his father's choices. Like, they've been together a very long time, but they still haven't been together for even a quarter, really, of Matthew's life. And so the extent to which he knows and loves and respects his father is also tempered by how little he understands about some of the things that his father has done, especially in the Wayback Machine.
Right. And, you know, going back to his comment about the decisions made in anger, and Eleanor is definitely something that happened when Matthew was angry. And I don't know that you could call it a decision, though, because I don't think that in that frame of mind one can actually make decisions. So even calling it a decision in the first place and then saying Matthew let her die, like it was, you know, like somebody drew up like a pros and cons table on it, and it's a little bit interesting. And I think that their relationship is going to evolve a lot over the course of this book. And I think Marcus is going to get to learn more about Matthew over the course of this book than he knows now.
And that seems to be in line with the larger themes of family and paternity and maternity and sort of creating a family and what you do when your parents disappoint you or when your parents do things that you don't understand, which is something we'll explore a great deal, I think, in the course of this series, and how fraught the relationship between parents and adult children can be when you are of the same age, maybe, that your parents were when they made certain decisions, or when you reach a level of perspective where you can identify with them and also choose differently.
Or until you perhaps find yourself standing in a very similar position, and then you gain much more perspective on their decisions than you had previously. So
we move into Matthew being
Diana's test
results, and which turns on all of Matthew's like ringing bells and danger signals, and he starts acting like a twit.
Yes. But also, Diana is the witchiest witch that ever witch did, apparently. Or at least for the last several hundred years.
Right. She is the witchiest of all witches. She just, like, while she was in the nest, she rolled in a great big puddle of witch, and
she can do all the things.
Just very, very blessed. Which is sort of, in some ways, it's a character complication. For me, I have more difficulty with it while I understand the role that it plays in the overarching plot. I have difficulty with it because you have her being sort of fundamentally so capable, like a Pandora's box of magical energy, and being fundamentally shut down. You know, you're made to understand that she has all this capability, but it's told to you rather than shown, which is one kind of like wobbly bit for me. But then also, like, once we know that we have it, it's like all the more frustrating that she can't, one, that she's not paying a hell of a lot of attention to it, and number two, that she doesn't seem to get the opportunity to develop it for a long time.
And I'm not sure how much I like knowing all of the possible things that Diana could potentially do. Because Because then I feel like I go through reading the rest of the series and I'm like, oh, is this particular thing going to show up or is it not going to show up? Because not all of them do. And I'm like, well, then why am I supposed to care so much that she could do all of these things, you know? And then I sit there the whole time and I'm like, okay, well, which power is this supposed to be?
You know, it's a possibility that I just don't like the placement of this. I understand why it's here because I think it is a trigger for Matthew in particular. I think it is a challenge for him, and I don't have a lot of good words to describe why I think that is.
I think I would have preferred it if perhaps Marcus had come over, you know, with the test results, said we have the test results, and if Matthew had not looked at them and, you know, just perhaps put them in his briefcase and said, it's not the time to do this now. You know, and we save that for a little bit later.
Fair enough. Perhaps I would appreciate the test results more if they all came at the same time, because there is a point, I believe, later in this book where we get more information about Diana's DNA, and perhaps that would have been a better place for it, but I think I know what it is we're doing, because we come back to this a good deal. I just find it I find that it is one of Matthew's weaker moments when he is being arrogant and stubborn and basically being patriarchal about saying, no, Diana's not ready for this. This is not the time. And I accept the desire to protect and saying, like, she's been through a lot today. Now is not the time to lay it on her. But the stuff about the covenant, I want to shake him.
Yeah, that part, I totally understand the withholding of the test results. And in our next reading, we're going to talk about that more because I believe that's when he actually talks to her about it. But yeah, the covenant, I'm like, why wouldn't you tell her? It's a really important, like, it's a big deal.
It's not only a big deal, it's a big deal that's about to make you flee the country.
Yeah. So it rings really false to me. It rings very much like false conflict, and then when it comes up again, when Diana does actually find out about it, and you're just like, okay, like, do we have to do this? And I don't really, there's not like a reason for him not telling her.
No, there's not, and it's, again, weakness and a sort of bump in Matthew that we have to kind of work out, where definitely, like, he is arrogant enough to believe that she doesn't have to know because he's going to be able to fix it. He's going to be able to shield her, use his power and influence, and basically that will be enough to keep the wolves from the door. And it isn't, but it's also really arrogant and terrible of him not to have a conversation so that she makes free choices about what she wants to do. And that's where I find there to be a really interesting thematic conflict between the ethics that Marcus is talking about the ethics that he was taught by his father, and his father basically not abiding by Diana's ability to have agency and choice.
Yeah. Which we talked about a little bit in our last reading, this like wiffle waffling with Matthew. Is he dangerous or isn't he? Is he patriarchal or isn't he? Like, is he? And it's kind of like our flowing back and forth of that a little bit again, I think, too.
And that's not to say that he necessarily has to be one or the other, or that he can't be complicated and tangled and dark and troubled, you know, deeply damaged.
Because he definitely is.
He definitely is. And but
I don't know that we need to make him more so.
No, I don't think so. And perhaps it is just, there are some ways, I guess, in which I prefer this, because we are showing the conflict in Matthew rather than telling about it. It's not a story about all the bad things that Matthew has done. It is him actually behaving in a way that is at odds with the best version of himself that somebody else has described. And you understand that he is incomplete and that he is imperfect.
And moving on just a little bit, we do get a little bit more of the Eleanor story in this chapter as well. And we find out that it was Matthew and Baldwin who killed Eleanor, and that nobody could really tell, you know, what happened between the three of them, except that she got between the two of them when they were arguing, and when they both came to their senses, she was dead. You know, nobody could tell, like, who actually killed her. So I find Matthew's guilt about it like we talked about in the chapter with Hamish, to be all the more, not necessarily confusing, but just more misplaced than I thought it was before.
It's definitely a difficult thing, and Matthew's inability to forgive himself and to forgive other people. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. He's incredibly hard on other people, but that's also because he's not terribly generous with himself when it comes to that. And I don't think it matters to Matthew whether he or Baldwin is actually responsible. I think that for him, the loss of control and the inability to manage that situation is enough. It is the thing that sort of he flagellates himself with all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Consistently to excess.
Probably every night before bed.
I think it's interesting in this chapter, the idea of sort of readiness and identity, where you have to be in a certain place to have an appropriate perspective on who you are or what you need, and you have to be ready for certain steps. And the thing I find interesting about it is that I think that it's a nice, pretty thought. I don't think it ever works that way. I don't think that you are ever ready to be who you are until you are that person. Does that make sense? That seems silly.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. I understood.
Are you sure?
I understood.
Well, hallelujah, because I wasn't sure as it was coming out of my mouth whether it made any sense at all.
Basically, like, you can't stand there and be like, I am ready now, and then change. You sort of, like, it happens, and then you're like, oh, okay.
And I think it's less about, like, I am ready. You can be ready to make a choice, and you can be ready to sort of recognize who you already are. I'm not sure that you can be like, I am ready to evolve without having already done so. I think it's one of those things you notice sort of belatedly, and by the time you were ready to admit, that it's a thing that you wanted to do, you've kind of already done it.
In hindsight.
So I think that Matthew's paternalism in terms of Diana being ready is both sort of misplaced, and it is a very sort of control-oriented way of looking at personal growth.
Since we have more explanation of the congregation, what do you think about his decision about Peter Knox and Gillian Chambers?
I think it's reckless.
Yeah.
Like, I think that this is a situation where we do see Matthew's anger playing out in a way that forces him to make some really poor choices. Because we know with a certain amount of perspective that the only thing going after Gillian Chamberlain and Peter Knox is going to do is poke the congregation in the eye. Like, you only make it worse by engaging with Peter Knox and Gillian Chamberlain, particularly when it comes to violence or threats of violence.
Yeah. And it really doesn't accomplish anything. I mean, other than exacting a vicious and angry sort of revenge, like kind of to sate the anger in the moment, removing Gillian from the table doesn't really do anything in the long run. She is not a major player.
We don't find that out in this chapter, though, do we?
I thought it was like fairly clear what his decision about her was in this chapter.
I think so too.
We don't find out like specifically what happened until later, but his decision was made in this chapter. His
decision is absolutely made, and it's textually appropriate within the next chapter that something has changed, and that change appears to be that Matthew is no longer hungry.
Right.
So... What?
But like, it doesn't do any other than making him feel better in the moment. Strategically, it does nothing.
Until later, where I think it's another pinch point for sort of Diana's identity when it comes up again, and for what her relationship is to Matthew when he contains this dark, angry, violent, but also hungry side. Because there is an extent to which we talk about but don't explore what it means when you are partnered to someone that eats humans, and humans, or warm bloods. Like, your friends could be eaten. It's always sort of like nameless until it's not. And
you're like,
Like, maybe I'm okay. Like, Diana has that breezy thing about, like, well, sometimes, you go have stag, and sometimes I eat pigeon. And it's like, and sometimes you eat my friends.
Darling, I didn't know she was your friend.
Too late. Too late. I can just imagine like a vampire scrolling through Facebook and being like, this one? Okay, this one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
Like, did she provide him with a list? These are the people that you cannot eat.
You can nibble on this one, but not that one. Oh man, the wheels came off of that very quickly.
And it's a legitimate question, I mean.
It is, and we just don't explore it. And again, like it's a problem of playing with the vampire thing. Like I sort of give Deb a great deal of credit for creating that very specific conflict where it's like, it's one thing to have this romantic vision of vampires. It is quite another when a vampire is your bud.
Right. I feel like it's just a question and a problem that Deb wasn't really interested in engaging in solving.
No, but she is interested in creating that conflict in a meaningful way for later. So we don't really spend a lot of time sort of unpacking it, but we do actually like place it squarely. That's a real conflict. That is not false.
No. Yeah. She'll play with it when it matters, and when it doesn't matter, she ignores it.
To the extent that one has a vampire romance, again, I think maybe there are some things that you just sort of go ba-na-na-na-na, ba-na-ba-na, like just sort of waltz past.
We get Juliet in this chapter too.
We do.
Discussion about Juliet for the first time.
We get like a tiny sprinkling of Juliet, and then at the very end of this chapter we have this beautiful moment with Matthew and Diana where he is...
It's so good.
I know. And when he's reciting the poetry and that bit like Huntress of Myself, that thing where Diana, it's like, where she is going to, like, whether he wants it or not, number one, like he's a goner. Number two, she's going to ferret out all of the things about him that he doesn't like. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah. And it's just, it's so sweet, and it actually is a very nice character moment for both of them as well, with him saying, you know, that he's a lost man, and her saying, you're not lost, I found you. Because I feel like, and as we've discussed before, Matthew has been lost quite a lot during his extended existence. So I think it has a lot of thematic weight, not just I found you as in like I found this relationship, I found you as a person, but you know, you're not lost. Your life, it has a purpose, it has a meaning, you know, and I found you. I am the meaning that, you know, you've been waiting for, basically.
Well, and I found you, and I will find you again. Like, you have been buried underneath literal eons of self-pity and loss and grief. And
crotchety old man.
Right. And as we talked about, you know, the things that Diana smells of are hope and new beginnings. She is the turning under of who Matthew was to who Matthew can be. And that's a really lovely thing. And
not to mention another manifestation of her power. A new power.
Right. A new power.
Yes.
But I also like what this chapter or this little piece has to say about love and bravery and strength and weakness and what it means to be in a partnership or at the beginning of an emotional partnership where you are responsible for helping someone face the worst parts of themselves or bearing witness to it. And you make an agreement or you decide to hopefully, you know, help them shoulder it.
Yeah. And I like, too, her awareness of him. Like, even she is asleep, you know, she has been sedated. She's had this traumatic experience. And her awareness of him, even in that state where she is, like, so attuned to his presence and, like, what he's thinking and feeling, even though she's, like, very much detached and very much vulnerable, like, physically vulnerable. But her having this moment where she, you know, is able to meet him where he is in his mental place, and, you know, while she is vulnerable, say, you know, but I am also brave. Yeah. Brave enough for both of us. And I think it's wonderful and lovely.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So as we move into chapter 17, Diana wakes up and she has that moment where she says that they're lying there like spoons, and I like the idea that they fit, that they're just like nicely like nestled into one another. And we were talking very briefly about the perspective and the understanding of one's parents and how they might have felt. And I love that she has this really terrifying but beautiful moment where she realizes how her mother must have felt reaching out for her father when they were killed, and how it causes her to ball up at first, and then she actively sort of like chooses Matthew and turns towards him because she now knows what her mother would have felt. And that mirroring is really, really pretty.
And we have some discussion of her fears and her coming to terms with the situation that she's in, and Matthew finally being able to get through to her and cut through her denial, and her coming to an agreement that, if they do not deal with this, it's not going to go away. Like, this is something that has to be dealt with, and she can't run. She'll never stop running unless they turn around and face it and figure it out. Which is something that he's been working towards this whole time, at least since they, took yoga class, and we had that discussion where he's trying to get her to reconcile her magic and reconcile everything that's happening. And it's finally, we've reached the point where she is in agreement, or is reaching an agreement with him about that. And then we get the witch wind.
I actually really like the first half of this chapter. I think that the way in which Matthew is engaging with Diana is actually really measured and respectful, and you can tell that he is doing his very best not to overpower or threaten or control her. And there's a lot to be said, I think, for the question of like, what is control in the context of becoming yourself, and what does it mean to sort of be able to manage your own emotions and manage who you are. But the way that he negotiates it, where he specifically asks for forgiveness for cornering her, and asks to be able to touch her under the circumstances where he can tell that she is not thinking clearly. I actually really like that I think it's one of Matthew's better moments in this, very, especially contrasted with the last chapter where he was sort of on the edge of sanity, and in this one he seems to have reeled it back. But I sort of wonder if that's because he's not hungry anymore. Like, I know I get real hangry.
Oh yeah, Matthew was hangry, and now he's not.
Oh goodness.
We're just, I
think it's a legitimate question. Like, is his temper and his ability to interact with Diana on this level, because even if he doesn't see it this way, and even if it's like a really dark read on this, he was taking care of his basic needs. Like,
and I think that's something that we can track, actually. I think that's going to come up again quite frequently in the next 2 books, at least. In this book again, and then in the next book, definitely.
And there's so much that is in Matthew's character about, like, denial and control as a part of his identity, and part of the reason that he, like, how he manages and reconciles being who he is through this extraordinary asceticism in some ways, where, like, he does not seem to feed himself appropriately or regularly. He does not appear to engage with other vampires the way that would keep him socially healthy. Like, he's very much into denying himself in ways that are not entirely healthy.
Right. Yes, he's not great at personal care. And I think, that's an interesting conversation to have about, because he's so self-deprecating, and because he doesn't take care of himself, and because he has guilt about taking care of himself. It almost leads you into a discussion of kind of almost like a vampiric depression of sorts, where he doesn't eat properly, he doesn't take care of himself. Vampires don't sleep, but you know what I mean? Like, and this kind of, he only does it when he absolutely has to. So I feel like Matthew is walking around, 90% of the time, at least in the first 2 books, like with really low blood sugar. And
yeah, for sure. But that
and making
also,
poor choices.
That also leads us into a discussion about this book having a lot to say about you shouldn't be ashamed of who you are, and you shouldn't be ashamed of your needs. You know, your needs for safety or comfort or food or rest, or, I mean, that's being really pedestrian about it, but that you are who you are, and that is important and that matters. And to continue to be the best version of yourself, you also have to do maintenance. Like, you have to take care of yourself.
Yeah. And I think that's something we definitely revisit that as well, you know, as we get through into book 3. And that's all part of Matthew's arc, which is excellent.
Yes, it is. I love this scene where he makes her tea, too. The safety
so
and the domesticity and the homeliness of it is actually really touching and really human, which is just a really nice note for a vampire.
And there's a little, like, kind of comedy note as well, where he, like, opens the cupboards and there's, like, 500 teas in there. And he's like, really? Like, which one would you like?
It's right up there with the note in chapter 16 where he gets all cranky because she burned a hole in his rug. And Marcus is like, my father loves his antiques.
Yeah. What can I say? And we have her sitting there, you know, while he's doing the tea, and she's drinking the tea, and she starts using her white table, and he's like, what are you doing? I could tell you're doing something. I can see it and smell it. What are you doing?
And then she surrenders. I mean, she is in a better place than she was 3 or 4 chapters ago. She's actually not only able to admit it to herself, but able to admit it out loud to him that, nope, that's magic too, and that she has been using it all the time. And I think that it sets up a really nice moment with a couple pages later where Matthew purposefully withdraws from her and sort of says, like, you have set up this bargain about magic and how it works in your life, and you made it at this emotional place where you're lonely and you're frightened, and now every choice that you have is like a litmus test about, like, it's always a moment of complete success or utter failure. You have set up this sort of relationship with magic where every time you are who you are, it feels like failure to you, and that can't continue. And what I like about him withdrawing from that is that, like, that's a really hard thing to say to somebody, and him giving the distance that's necessary to say to that, I think, is one of the indicators of their fundamental compatibility. That he's able to say hard things to her, he's able to tell her the truth, but also give her the space in his best moments to process it.
Yes, in his best moments. And we chat a little bit on the phone with Sarah and Em, and Matthew.
Ooh, I have a question.
Yes, what's your question?
Do you think that on page 215, where Diana talks about how she could picture her sitting in the kitchen, phone to her ear, and hair wild about her face, I think she's actually seeing her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Definitely. Yeah, that's not just like, oh, I remember what my aunt looks like. That's like, no, you you're actually looking across to New York with your sight. And we get some cold water from Sarah and Em, as well, from Sarah, which is, you know, them being, you know, her saying to them, you know, like, oh, like, stop worrying, like, and they're like, we'll pick up the phone. Pick up the damn phone, Diana, and we won't worry about you.
Why do you think that Matthew decides to be really matter-of-fact all of a sudden?
I don't know. Was it a good time?
I mean, Diana sort of dancing around how dangerous things are is really not helpful at this point. But as sort of an expert secret keeper and a bit of a tap dancer with the truth himself, I find it sort of interesting that he picks that moment to be like, no, we're not doing this anymore.
Yeah. And maybe it's more like to get Sarah and Em on board, because he kind of has gathered that he, like, you can't BS with the aunts. You cannot BS the aunties. That's not a thing that happens. And I think he recognizes that. And what do you think about the fact that Sarah and Em know Peter Knox and they know that he's a creeper? Which brings our whole discussion, you know, previously when Em was all like sweetness and light and all witches are Galinda. into serious question because you're like, okay, so, but like, except for this one that you knew about already.
Right. But it also makes me reevaluate and potentially recontextualize Em and Sarah's relationship with the world of creatures. Like, perhaps they chose to retreat to upstate New York, to a coven that was like kinder and sweeter and is bobbing for apples and like pointy-toed shoes, as opposed to this larger, more sinister world. And I think we get more and more of a sense as we go on that, for Em at least, going to upstate New York was a bit of a retreat from that. And I think it's interesting that Matthew assumes that they will know as well. Like, he has that moment where he's sort of like reaching across the bridge to them and saying, you and I both know what this means, and she's not treating it with it.
She's not, yeah. Well, and she's not in on it either.
Well, and she's not treating it with the gravity that she ought to.
Yeah. So then do we think then, since maybe they have retreated to New York and maybe built this world around themselves that has insulated them from the wider world of creatures, do you think Em then is purposefully lying to herself and being purposefully naive just like out of habit because that is the world that they have created around themselves?
I think that, Diana has this moment in this chapter where she talks about how Em was always a bit more fragile after Stephen and Rebecca died. And I think that Em's Pollyanna-ishness is a coping mechanism. And I think that the text demonstrates that she has retreated to a witchy existence, which is relatively easygoing and quiet and no hanky-panky, no danger, no disaster, and perhaps she's just managed to convince herself over time that Stephen and Rebecca were an aberration, or that they really truly believe that witches had something to do with it, and that they just retreated, that's part of their trauma.
And then, hey, we go to France. We jump on the...
But before we go to France, there's a trope that bugs me, and that trope is the idea that in order for a female character to be likable, relatable, engaged, or otherwise desirable, she has to be quote-unquote low maintenance. And we have this whole moment where...
Oh, the packing thing.
The packing thing, and Matthew makes this comment about Louisa not being willing to cross the street without, 10 steamer trunks, which I love as a character note. It's fantastic. But then Diana says this thing about not being known for being high maintenance. That is... I just think that there's an awful lot of social weight for a reader that is placed on that trope, and I don't care for it. I accept...
You're so different from other girls, honey.
But it goes back to that, I do think there's a character note buried underneath it, which is that discussion of Diana wanting to be unremarkable, and that a lot of her sort of tomboyishness and lack of style, whatnot, is so she doesn't stand out, and so she doesn't attract attention, and so that she doesn't invite scrutiny, and it's like a camouflage thing. And yet, at the same time, I don't like the value judgment that is inherent in that page.
I don't either, and I feel like you're right. With Diana, it does feel like more of a character note, and it's something that will definitely develop over the course of the series. And this kind of the idea of, one, like you said, she wants to be unremarkable. We've had this history of her when she has engaged with, the opposite sex, or has been less careful about her appearance when things have gone awry, in her teenage years or whatever. And so maybe that's part of it as well. But also the idea that Diana is kind of homeless in the sense that she's a wanderer a bit. And so I buy that she doesn't have a lot of belongings. But yeah, the tomboy thing, that part of it is irritating. You could still have a hairdryer and makeup, and still be low maintenance. It's fine.
Right, and perhaps it has something more to do with Diana's need to earn everything sort of twice over, where she feels like if she engages with any of the fripperies of modern femininity, that she is somehow taking away from the rest of her achievements. I do think that she has a tendency to be really obnoxiously earnest about things like that. And perhaps that's just an extension of that character trait, is that the idea about being low maintenance, because it's perfectly okay to be feminine, and there is certainly a version of romantic fantasy where the tomboy girl next door meets and falls in love with the tall, dark, handsome stranger, and she's wonderful and lovable for reasons that include the fact that she's not very difficult to live with.
Yeah.
But again, it's okay to have needs, and it is okay to need to feel secure in your appearance, and it is okay to dress up sometimes.
And I would just like to make a point of order, which is that Diana is an internationally sought after and renowned scholar, and those people generally do have a wardrobe that is more than just yoga pants, because they have to professionally if they're going to be lecturing internationally, and I find that to be completely unbelievable.
Well, it could just be that she's in Oxford for the year to study, and she only brought her crummy library clothes.
Sure. Although she does talk about, giving lectures, and she has that keynote that she's going, like, what's she going to wear to the keynote? Her yoga pants?
Her birthday suit?
Her birthday suit? One of her pilly sweaters. I don't like it.
Boat grease.
Yes.
Or a cowl neck sweater, which apparently she owns a ton of.
So yeah, I find that to be stretching the distance on my patience in the believability of.
Right. We will all come to points where our investment of belief in this series is challenged. Mine comes in chapters 19 and 20. I have some thoughts. But anyways, I digress.
Mm-hmm. And I do like that we have a little comic wink to all of Matthew's vampire money at the end of this chapter. And he's like, well, if you've lived as long as I have, you could have this much money too. But I have another note about that when we get to France, actually, and we meet our servant vampire.
Indeed. Curious. Don't understand.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that some more.
But, nous sommes en France, and we enchanté Isabeau.
Izzy Boo!
Izzy Boo!
My boo!
In contrast to her, icy description, apparently smells of, warm things.
Yes.
She smells of, sarsaparilla and caramel, and so she seems like she would be, a really nice wintertime drink. She does sound really tasty, and she, let's be very honest, I want to grow up to be Izzy Boo. Izzy Boo is one of my favorite characters in the entirety of All Souls, and whenever I read this, I hear Jennifer Ikeda's magnificent voice reading it from the audiobook, and I adore the way that she meets Diana and says, I do not like the way that witches smell.
And she does a little
She is sweet and repulsively green like spring. I love it. I actually love it. I mean, I know that, Izzy Boo is being a horrendous creature for, the next maybe 8 chapters, but I kind of love her.
Mm-hmm. No, she's fantastic and has great style and great taste in clothes and furniture and a castle.
You don't say. She has great taste in furniture?
She does. I don't know if we mentioned this ever in the book, but I get the feeling that she does.
Goodness. So we find out that Matthew, being a medieval vampire, lives in a castle with his quote-unquote terrifyingly elegant French mother.
Which, Septour's literal translation, 7 towers.
So it's very large.
Very creative, also, naming.
Well, I mean, it's not like medieval castles have super great names.
I shall name my castle 2 Doors.
And mine should be 1 moat.
I went over to 6 stables the other day.
Oh, gracious. On 226, when we get the introduction of Mart, and we have her voice discussed as a combination between sand and treacle, I adore it. And that's actually another voice that Jennifer Ikeda does beautifully, is Mart's voice. About the servant vampire thing.
Yeah. So, okay. So, vampires are rich, except Mart. And maybe some other people we meet later. So that leads me to ask, was she already a servant when she was turned and elected to remain so? Is that or did she become a servant after and there's just this whole serving class of vampires? Or were these people already servants when they were turned and they just like stayed that way?
I think it is option B, although, I mean, the relationship of the de Clermont family with their servants appears to be exceptionally familial anyways. So, and it does appear that, like, the servants have some means, but I'm not really sure that I would be like, yes, I would really like to work for your family for eternity.
Forever. I would love to be a servant forever. And, you know, she's adorable and a doll, and she seems to love it, but I find being a servant forever would probably be quite taxing, and I would elect not to do that. Or is it, you know, the values of when they were actually still human, you know, the idea of the serving class was very much a value that was held, and perhaps they have retained that in their, you know, personal value system.
I mean, it certainly could be that. I think that it's an open question of the extent to which the era in which you were made a vampire stays with you, and whether you can really ever fundamentally adapt to a new era, like whether you can change over time, whether that is a choice or it's just sort of like a fixed part of your identity. I love Mart. I'm really glad that she's there. She seems quite content to be there. And
just bake the bread and, you know, whatever for eternity.
Make omelets forever.
Make omelets forever.
I do like that she's older, though. I think that's really kind of cool that it's not all the vampires are, like, really extraordinarily gorgeous. You have some that are sort of craggy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Diana even notes, she's like, oh, you know, she was older when she was turned, and she was old enough that, you know, her becoming a vampire did not change her appearance very much.
Mm-hmm. We haven't really gone through much of the metaphysics of becoming a vampire and what changes. It's not like there's that awfully weird bit in Twilight about, you know, all the things that change when Bella becomes a vampire, from her sight to her speed to all of these other things, and it's kind of weird. And it's sort of like magical healing sexy potion, whereas
everything becomes sexy and magical.
Right, whereas it would appear for the All Souls vampires, you do get stronger and faster, but mostly you're sort of who you are forever.
Yeah, you might get a gloss. You get like a glossy coat, perhaps. You get a touch of veneer. Yes. But that's about it. What do you think about Matthew's 700 years in the tower?
I think that lead is somewhat buried until Diana goes to bed in his bed and she realizes that you would have to go through him to get out of the tower, and she gets the sense that he's been protecting himself from his family for millennia, and I think that tells you everything you need to know.
What do you think about his artifacts, the Matthew Museum that we get in this chapter?
I think that I get what it's doing, right? I get that it's sort of this, if I could take Mr. Cate's soul and have it condensed into a bunch of artifacts and like see what he chose to maintain after a millennia of existing, that would be fascinating. Like, that would be a really interesting glimpse into all the things that he could never tell me, or there's a story behind everything that we choose and that we keep and that they're part of who we are. And yet, we kind of already did that in his apartments in Oxford, so I'm not entirely sure why we're doing it again.
Because we really like chairs and suits of armor and rugs and things?
I think we like populating this room, and that's fine. That's certainly fine. I'm certainly more motivated by, rather than Matthew's objects, I'm more interested in the people he keeps and his relationships that we see developing with the people. Like, what I like about Isabeau's introduction and Marcus talking about her is we get a sense of how hurt Isabeau is that she is, or that he is doing this to her. And that's a very maternal sort of hurt that's hard to put into words. It's like, you are making me profoundly uncomfortable on purpose, you ungrateful child. And she's very protective.
Okay, I have a question for you.
I hope I have an answer.
Okay, so in this chapter, we get one of perhaps two, maybe three, but only two off the top of my head times where somebody sneaks up on Matthew. And the other one we are going to discuss at length when we get to book 3. But this one, so Mart comes up the stairs and brings the tray, and Matthew doesn't hear her coming. I do not buy that at all. Not one little bit at the end of the chapter.
Good point. I hadn't picked up on that.
Yeah. And it's, I think the first of maybe 3 times that somebody sneaks up on him. And we've already had this whole discussion about his fantastic hearing and smell, etc., etc. I don't buy it.
I was about to say something very crass, and I bit it back, so...
You could still say it.
No, I think that his...
Thoughts were elsewhere?
I think that his intentions are elsewhere, right? Because at the moment that he sneaks up, he's basically with Diana, who has been described as being like a beehive in summer, and they're having this
description.
This very intimate moment where he's like, don't worry, even Coco Chanel wasn't good enough for my mother, which might be reassuring to me if I were Diana. Like, I certainly understand what it feels to be set upon one's heels by one's mother-in-law. And so they're having this like intimate moment. It's like, will they, won't they? What are we doing? I brought you home. And then Marthe shows up and starts singing bawdy love songs.
Which is fantastic. Like, I love the moment. And so the reason I ask about it is because do we think there is some truth to Matthew knowing that being close to Diana means that he won't be able to keep her as safe as he would like to? That is going to be a continuing discussion. But I still am not sure that I buy it.
Do you think it's possible that he heard Marthe and just didn't care because it was Marthe?
Potentially.
And because we're in Diana's POV?
In this case, yeah, because it's not threatening at all. But having...
Well, I wonder because it's...
I would like to believe that he did hear her and just doesn't...
I sort of think that he doesn't care because of the way he reacts, where he's like, tee-hee, sing me the bawdy love song and I'll sing it back. And we're in Diana's POV, so it just says before our lips touched, a tray clattered on the table. So he could have been thoroughly intent on just being like, I'ma smooch you. And then she's the one that's embarrassed. Or it's also that Mark just enjoyed making a lot of noise, which I can also buy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Definitely. She's a wily one.
She is wicked, and I like her.
Do you like her relationship with our boo, Izzy Boo? Do you like them together? I think they're darling.
I do. I certainly do, because it's clear that over the millennia, they are like two creatures who are fundamentally compatible in some way, where they've just managed to spend eons in the same house doing their things. I love the vision of them that we get with sort of Isabeau at the head of the table reading the newspapers and Marthe devouring murder mysteries.
Trashy paperbacks.
I love that. I love that contrast and the fact that they can just like sit there companionably every morning for time immemorial.
And then we get horsies.
And, well, then we get a very nice bath and nap.
Oh, yeah.
Which all of this sounds lovely, right? This is the moment where we're like in full... This is why the plot sort of lulls here, because we're in full-on like romantic... I would love to go to my fancy French boyfriend's house.
Yes.
Right. Fancy French boyfriend's house, have a big tub, there's a giant library. It's basically like Beauty and the Beast without the Stockholm Syndrome, where, and then Diana gets the scent of the horses and goes skittering off into the stables. It is somewhat reckless to just offer yourself as a scratching post to a very large horse that you don't know, to an unknown horse.
Unknown horse. Mm-hmm. But maybe that is a little bit of Diana's magic again, being able to be in tune with the animals that we're going to talk about more in our next reading. But I think that is maybe just something she doesn't realize that she's doing. But everybody else is like, whoa, this is a terrible idea. And she's like, nah, it's fine.
Right. The horses and I, we are
the horses and I have an agreement.
As someone who spends a great deal of time with horses, sometimes that works and sometimes that does not. Sometimes that does not. We get the book in between. So she sees her first bit of the book that Matthew has used to lure her to France, like a particularly lovely medieval carrot. And then we go to the stables, right, and we meet Fallon and Hector, whom I want to see more of just because I enjoy the idea of Matthew being sort of a country squire surrounded by big dogs and horses. And so, yeah, the bit about the horses, they're sort of necessary to some extent for the development of the plot, and I think we could talk a lot about Diana's relationship with hooved things, and we can maybe talk about whether we think that horses are somehow special as like a vehicle for the hunt or as another aspect of the goddess, particularly of like more of a Celtic triplicate mother goddess. Several of those have sort of horse sympathy, so that could be something that we talk about, but
perhaps when they actually go and ride the horses. next time.
Yes, I think it is more interesting in some ways that they're exchanging these poetic and song references, which I think have a lot more depth to them than I originally realized, especially the ones about the fact that this relationship they're in is dangerous for both of them, and they're sort of talking around it while suspended in this fairy tale French countryside town and country romance thing.
Right. So the quote specifically that I find to be very interesting, desire urges me on as fear bridles me, which calls back to our epigraph at the very beginning of the book and talks about their relationship and in some ways Diana's identity crisis that she's going through, so I think it has a lot of different layers to it.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly linked to her desire for Matthew, and it's linked increasingly to her desire for understanding of herself and the fear of what that uncovers. And it's a really nice way to bring us back to the thematic import of what's going on in England, even if I'm still annoyed that in some ways, I do love France. I love France. But I just the pacing sort of slows and we take a different focus, and that focus, I think, is...
Not be the last time that the pace goes awry when we go to France.
Right.
France has its own time bubble.
I think France kind of does have its own time bubble.
There's suspension.
What do we think is the significance of the dream?
I am not sure, except that the thing that I can think of off the top of my head is Diana becoming more connected to her magic and more connected. We get more of these dreams, and the huntress images and the goddess as Diana becomes more attuned to her magic. So I think that is largely where that comes from. What do you think? You think yes?
Yes, I think it has to do with her unconscious connection to her capability and her power and the capacity to be more, and that if she surrenders and sort of embraces who she is capable of being, then she does have the capacity to both literally and figuratively fly, and that the world of magic is hers to command. So I think it's a nice place to end that reading.
I have a hypothetical question to end with.
Go on.
We have no evidence of this whatsoever, but it's just like, because we know that when Diana is sleeping or whatever, her magic just does whatever it does. Does she levitate in the bed while she's having this dream?
I don't know.
Does she fly?
I think that would be really interesting.
I don't know either, but I'm like, I think probably yes.
But I would also think if that's the thing that happened, that Matthew would be like, hey, did you know you levitate in your sleep?
Based on all the evidence we have of what happens when she's not paying attention. But he wasn't there.
We don't know that.
I mean, potentially. I thought he drew the bed curtains. So isn't she just like in there in the little box with the curtains? No? Or is that not? Is this the time that he draws the curtains?
No, he draws the curtains the first time. This time she just indicates that she flung herself into the bed, and we have no idea where he is.
Okay. It's just my thought. It's just my hypothetical question.
I like it. I like it as an image. I think it could be a fun idea.
That's it. Is that all we have to say on those 3 chapters?
I think all we have.
That was quite a lot.
I was going to say, I think we've said a good deal. And so for our next reading, we will be doing chapters 19, 20, and 21. Thank you so much to those of you who have left us reviews on iTunes and who have communicated with us through Twitter and email. We really appreciate it. I think we'll look to do another listener feedback episode probably in the new year. So if you have comments or questions or thoughts or applause or whatever you'd like to send our way, you can find us at chamomile@gmail.com.
Yes, and you can find us on Twitter at chamomile in Clove with an N, or you can find both of us individually on Twitter as well. And we do, again, really appreciate your ratings and reviews. It helps people find us. We like reading what you think about the show, so thank you to those of you who have done it. And if you haven't done it, please consider doing so.
And well, we look forward to seeing you next time, and we look forward to continuing photographs and sneak peeks from the television production as they rise. So we will talk to you guys in 2 weeks.